This is the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Neiman. If you're looking to generate wealth and passive income in the lucrative world of mobile home parks, you're in the right place. You'll discover solutions to the common legal and operational pitfalls and how to optimize parks to maximize income. Your host is in the trenches. He's a real estate attorney, financial analyst, and mobile home park investor and operator. Now, let's turn it over to Ferd Neiman.
Welcome back, Mobile Home Park Nation. Ferd Neiman here again today with another episode of the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast. Excited to have you listen to one of my guests today. Another good guest for you. Got a lot of experience. We're going to cover a lot of the deal sourcing and DD and acquisition process through closing. He's got a lot of expertise and lessons learned. So please help me welcome my guest, Jason Janda. Jason, thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you, Ferd. Thanks for having me. Big fan.
Hey, well, likewise. Well, you're another recovering attorney like myself. So I guess I still practice probably more than you, but tell us a little more about your background and how you got into MH.
Definitely. Like you said, background is as an attorney, worked in-house at a couple of private equity shops, real estate private equity shops. And then from there, worked in the law firm setting and really fell into MH by doing borrower's opinions for Fannie and Freddie. And so in the process of seeing some of the financials and the spread that existed at the time, this is back 2012, 2013, the spread between what Fannie and Freddie would lend versus what prevailing cap rates were, the space looked very attractive at the time.
Don't you wish you could rewind some of that and go find some deals with a 500 bip spread or 800 bips or even beyond? Not as easy today as it was then.
Oh my gosh. The default even back then for very quality stuff was 250 to 300 basis points. And I go through this old dead deal file just to give myself a laugh and, throw a dart. Every single one of them would have been a good deal. Right.
I remember when I first started, I was like, if it's not a 12 cap, I'm not even going to look at it on current income. And it's like, man, I passed up on one deal in particular that, it had a bunch of vacancy, but it was in a good market. I'm like, I'm not going to pay this kind of cap rate. And somebody else paid a 5 cap. And I thought they were crazy. But then I watched, I'm like, yeah, but the cap rate doesn't really matter if you're going to do a bunch of infill. It's not today's cap rate value. It's what's the end value and what's the reasonable probability to get there from assumptions and infill and, future rents, future expenses, future cap rates. So live and learn. But tell us some examples. Give me some stories and give me some tips on what you've been able to learn over the years.
So, we typically source through 3 ways. We'll either go direct, which is always the preferred route, right? That usually gets us better pricing, get better relationship directly with the seller, better understanding of what the seller's needs are and how we can tailor the transaction, right? End of the day, we just want to close. And so if that is the seller carrying back paper because that's what they want, if it's hitting a certain number that we can't justify yet, but helping them restructure some of their leases to generate additional revenue, we can help them do that. So, that's the preferred route. But as you know, there's more and more people touching more and more owners nowadays. And so a lot of times we're stuck going either the wholesaler route or the broker route. And, each comes with its own benefits and challenges, right? With a wholesaler or a broker, the seller's real, right? Rather than just, asking you to spend a lot of time and hoping that, one day they'll sell to you. So, in each of those, what we've come to do more and more, especially now, is a lot of times we would go directly to PSA. Hey, here's a PSA. You want a contract? We're real. Sign it. Let's go. But nowadays, just to get the whole ball rolling and move faster, we do a lot of LOIs where, they're non-binding, but it's got, the meat and potatoes of everything that we're going to agree to. It's a page. And if everyone agrees on that, at least we know we've got a live one and we can proceed with a PSA shortly thereafter.
Yeah, interesting approach. Yeah, I hear you on LOI first. I've kind of done morph the two, and I go with an LOI first, but it's a pretty robust LOI, 2 or 3 pages, and it's got a binding provision, which is unique. And I've been able to have some success with that. And I give it away to people all the time. I'm happy to send you a copy as well. And where it's helped me is I've had sellers that won't sign the long form PSA because they just get heartburn. They're like, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not paying for a lawyer, and I'm not going to sign a document that requires a lawyer. But the LOI, they're happier to sign. And I've had a couple of people push back and say, well, why is this binding? LOIs are supposed to be non-binding. And I said, well, I'm spending a lot of time and energy on this, and I'm going to spend more time and energy and money if we go to the next step. I'm a man of my word. Here's the terms. Are you a man of your word? If so, why would you not sign a binding? I don't want to go spend, for all I know, as soon as I walk out of here, somebody else can offer you $1 more or a day faster, and you're going to, take it. And we have terms here. We have an agreement. We have some camaraderie together. I thought we were there, man. And then I don't like, I say guilt people, but I convinced them to sign the LOI at that time. And then I've kind of got them in the mode of, this is real. This is happening. And then we go to PSA. And then, it also helps me push a little harder, fight a little harder on the PSA. Cause I'm like, whoa. Because sometimes they'll do the LOI on their own. And then they'll be like, I don't need a lawyer. But then you give them the contract, like, okay, I guess I need a lawyer. Well, the lawyer wants to rip apart the contract. I'm like, hey, man, those terms were already agreed to by your party under the LOI. Like, for example, I love to have these, I'm sure you too, love to have the inspection period start if and when and after I receive the last of the title commitment, the survey, and the seller deliverables. I don't put all those seller deliverables in the LOI because it's going to scare people. I put them in the contract, but I've also got the title commitment survey. Well, the seller's attorney always wants to have the time inspection period start when? At the effective date. Yep. And by the way, I can sometimes provide a lower price with a fast DD. So I've said 20-day DD, 20-day close. Well, I know I'm not going to really be able to close that fast if I'm getting a bank loan, but I also know the title commitments are 3 weeks backed out right now. So that buys me 3 weeks of time. And it's not my fault, that title commitments are slow, but I also know that the seller is going to have a hard time producing all these documents in one day. Even brokered transactions, most of the brokers do a good job. They get all the stuff in the Dropbox deal room on the front end, but they can't get the title commitment with me as the buyer on there until we have a contract, until the earnest money is in and the escrow is open. So anyway, I like the LOI. Have you had pushback? So you're doing the LOI more now because you've had pushback going straight to contract?
Typically, yes. But our LOI process is almost identical to yours. Well, a lot of what you're saying is the same thing, right? So our typical person we're dealing with, they're interested in just a couple things. One, how much EMD are they getting? Two, what's the timeline for DD? And three, when is this closing, right? So much like you, we require all the seller deliverables first. We don't require the title commitment before the timeline starts running. Because our idea is once we get the seller deliverables, we've got a 70-75% surety that, hey, we're going to proceed with this, right? Because we've already driven it. We've already checked it out. Someone's put eyes on it. If we're not close, we've even done it where, I'll throw a Facebook marketplace or Craigslist ad, Venmo someone $50-$75 to drive it, shoot us a couple iPhone videos, and then text those back to us. Right.
Yeah, so, I've done that. I've even found people, it's hard to find somebody who's good at it, but that'll do a drone video.
That's amazing.
It was like $100. So it's pretty cool. I don't know. I have a drone. I bought the cheapest drone possible. It was like $49 and it's horribly difficult to fly. This is just because blowing around in the wind. I'm like, I don't want to spend $1,000 on one because for fear of running it into the office building. But anyway, it's pretty high. It's a pretty high quality video, actually.
Oh yeah. And it works. And especially once you own it, if you can do a drone video, anything to bring further traffic to your property, right? Whether you're posting that drone video on YouTube or on your website or what have you. But back to the LOI, so we'll provide a decent EMD, but then really it's like yourself. We know the timeline of some of this stuff. So even if we're going to get bank financing, we might say, hey, there's no financing contingency, right? This is a cash deal. But we know it's going to take about 45 days. I know I've got a couple of banks, not the best terms, but I can get stuff closed in 21 to 30 days if need be on, slightly worse terms. But if that gets me the better price, then, that's what we're going to do to execute.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that's a huge lift in your offer in the seller's eyes if you say no financing contingency. And I have I do that all the time. I'm like, I'll tell them I'm going to get a loan, but it gives them confidence. I'll say, I'm going to get a loan, but I'm not worried about me getting approval. So I don't even need the contingency. I know I can get approved. You want to talk to my bankers? And then they're like, okay, if this guy's going to risk his EMD without having that contingency, because the last guy and the guy before that and the guy, they couldn't get a loan. And kind of like you, I've already driven the park. I already know the market. So I'm not fishing in ponds where I'm worried about getting a loan. I'm fishing in ponds where I'm like, this is in the footprint of my bank or a number of banks or a loan originator. So just I think that goes a long way with the seller for sure.
Definitely. And that coupled with, if we've got a slightly longer period, just releasing the EMD a little bit sooner, right? If we got all the seller deliverables, there's no excuse for taking more than 5 or 6 days to get through that.
What's your view on non-refundable earnest money? Do you let it go firm somewhere mid-process, or even do you do up front sometimes in order to win the deal? Because obviously that speaks loudly. It's just obviously it's painful for a buyer, so you got to be real comfortable with the amount and the timing and the other particulars.
Again, this to me goes back to, are you dealing with the seller directly or are you going through a broker, right? If you can figure out what the seller's needs are or what their touch points, this seller might have been trying to sell that property 3 times and got burned twice, right? Mm-hmm. So now they might say, oh, okay, hey, I don't want someone just kicking the can around, right? And so then we'll say, okay, hey, we'll put up earnest money and we'll just keep refilling it every 30 days. And we'll let you take it out non-refundable, dispersed to you in 30 days. Oh, wow. But we might need 60 days. We might need 90 days. Right. But at the meantime, you're not just wasting your time. You're going to be getting money. And we're going to be, the hold 'em term pot committed, right? We've got some in it. And so we're going to want to see this thing go through.
Yeah. Getting the earnest money released to the seller is super motivating for the seller. So yeah, I've had it happen a couple of times. And on one client deal, it was a big number. It was like $250,000, and the client was going to let it be released. And I was like, okay, we need to make sure the contract has default and breach provisions that we're real comfortable with. So, because in that case, the seller, we made them represent and warrant that they were unaware of any known sewer, water, other problems. And then during our DD, we found out it was massive sewer problems. And we found out they knew because they'd already got bids for $1 million for the sewer repair. So luckily we had that in the contract. So the quote non-refundable $250,000, in this case, it was still an escrow at the title company. So it wasn't released, but that non-refundable $250 became refundable because of the breach. And then there were also some other damages provisions because of the breach. But I was dealing with one last week, actually, on a client that we didn't do the PSA. We were doing the zoning work after the PSA, and it was $25,000 non-refundable. And there was no seller breach, no damage provisions. And guess what? The seller breached. Yeah. And now it's a problem. Right. Yeah. So you gotta be tread lightly. For you're a lawyer, you take care of yourself. But I think a lot of these guys out there, playing street lawyer, and sometimes it's easy, but sometimes it's not. And it's when you're talking about $25K or more, that's a big number, that they let get disappear. It was $1,000. Okay, who cares? Not even worth fighting over at that point, but big number, then you got to button it up better.
Definitely. And much as you said, we do the same thing. If there's any systems issues, that's one of the reps and warranties. But, I've more than a handful of times I've had people not tell the truth on that, right? I'm sure you've come across it too.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where, you got to get in there. You got to camera the pipes. We have a spreadsheet we send to every electrician, regardless of where they're located, of, hey, this is our spreadsheet. Fill this out for us. Right.
What are you looking for on that spreadsheet?
Oh, how many amps are they running at every single site? We'll get told by the seller. We just honestly don't believe them a lot of times.
Right.
Or overground wires, underground wires, any issues with the wiring, right, to the home. Any issues with the pedestals, the meter boxes, and then next to all that, because afterwards we get the electricians to write this up, because with the idea of, hey, we're going to need some work to get this fixed too. Sure. So give us an idea of what this is going to cost to fix.
Right.
Because like we want to be able, throughout the DD process, we've got to be building that CapEx budget. What's it going to cost for us to get this, stabilized, comfortable, with minimum 5 to 10 year run on it before we have a lot of other fixing to do.
I got a question for you. So I've inspected the electric similar, but I had an issue on one where the 100 amp service was working and was fine. And if I was going to bring in a 200 amp home, then I would have to upgrade to 200. But the one risk, and I ended up getting hit by it, was when you go inquire with the city as to the current electrical requirements, the city said, oh, well, let me come out and look at it. And now that I'm here, and we had power lines that were like 10 feet above the houses or less in some instances, they said, you got to put that all underground. It was a huge expense. Now we ended up kind of got lucky that because of all COVID supply chain, the city couldn't get the big transformer boxes. They were on back ordered. So they're like, well, never mind. I guess we can't go underground because we don't have the equipment to help you. So we'll just put in taller poles. And then they put in 45-foot poles instead of 20-foot poles. And they just elevated the electric, and we shared the expense. It still was a missed price for us, and missed DD costs, because they were all fine and good. And the electrician said they were all fine and good. But then this new city policy changed, or really implementation of policy, because in theory, there's always electrical safety policies. So I guess my point is, even when you're trying to be diligent, sometimes things go wrong. But I'm curious for you, when you have your electrician do that, do you ask them or direct them to talk to the city, or do you ask or direct them not to, or do you leave it in their hands?
We leave it in their hands, but much as you just described, I feel most of the time when we reach out to the various city administration officials, they're looking to find a problem. They're not looking to approve that things are good. And given the age of most of the communities we operate, right, there's usually something, right? When your typical community is built in the 70s or earlier, you're using 50-year infrastructure, 50-year planning.
Right.
If you've got, a really persnickety building inspector, they're going to find something to ding you with. And so what we're looking at is, visibly, all right, or do you have overhead lines that are close? Because that's going to be a problem, right? And we've had the same thing. We had to bury an entire community's lines, but fortunately it was only 40 sites or so. Still, relative to the NOI, it was a significant expense.
Right.
Where we've seen more problems typically has been on the sewer side, right? Yeah. And so on the sewer side, it's, one, hopefully there's enough cleanouts. If there are, we do pay a crew to just camera every single line they can. And then go out there with spray paint, right? Because by now, we've already done the seller's deliverables. We've already driven it ourselves. We've already probably gone in any park on homes we've got to take over. So we're pretty confident that, we're going to be taking this property over. So we want them spray painting wherever they find those cracks, those holes, what have you. So that way, when we take it over, that first week, we can get them back out there and start digging up those problem areas.
What's your least favorite type of sewer line? And are you indifferent? Are you okay with clay lines? Or do you only want PVC? Would you buy things that are Orangeburg or other piping material?
Well, Orangeburg, I would stay away from. We have one Orangeburg. We found out by accident. We were told it was galvanized when it was cameraed, right? Because it was so old and it was blackened inside. They said, oh, don't worry, you got galvanized pipe. It might last a little longer. That was great until about 3 months later when you had a line collapse, right?
Oh, wow.
And it was to the point to where it was just easier to bypass the existing system,
right,
and just drop PVC in with new laterals and new a couple mains. On the clay tile, again, it depends. If you're buying a brand new park that was built recently in the 90s or newer, you're not having some of these issues. But for a lot of the ones that are in the 70s, you're kind of stuck with what you've got unless you really want to open up that bag of worms and just start over with your piping.
Yeah, well, I feel like most of what we buy, it's already failed 50 times. So it's like 75% PVC and 25% other. And I had one park where the guy told me it was city water sewer. We looked at the lines. It looked like city sewer and it was PVC. All was right with the world. And then we closed on it. And a couple of days later, one of the residents said, "Are you going to clean out my septic?" So what do you mean septic? She said, yeah, every time it rains, anytime we use a shower or the washing machine, the sink fills up with toilet water. I was like, what? She goes, apparently this is a 90 pad park. 4 of the homes in the back were on septic, and we didn't check every single lot. Yeah. And we had no reason to think it was septic. And we ended up having to the last guy, instead of emptying the septic, he thought it'd be cheaper and easier we asked the maintenance person, do you guys have septic? He's like, yeah. The last guy, he didn't want to clean it out. It was too expensive. So he just took a stick of dynamite and threw it down in there and closed the lid. And thinking it would turn pieces of poop into smaller pieces of poop and that would work. No, it blew up the tank. So then all the guts of it didn't work properly, and it was still full. So we couldn't salvage it or pump it. So we had to hook it up to the main line. So it was, again, poof, thousands of dollars we were not expecting to spend, but we had no real choice.
Yep. No, we haven't had anything that bad, but we've definitely had situations where before we ever operated a lift station, we didn't bake in an additional expense for operating that lift station. Right? Whether it's the electric that's pouring through there, whether it's, having a backup pump, whether it's, pumping out that lift station, anything that doesn't, get pumped all the way up. And so just knowing some of this stuff, and unfortunately, a lot of it's through bad experience. Right. And so much like you started, the seller deliverables, that checklist keeps getting bigger and bigger. We're pretty honest with people. We say, hey, look, we're not expecting everything, but we've noticed if we don't ask you for it, we're not going to get it.
Right.
And then on to that, so on the physical side, I'm right with you where it's, water lines are kind of hard, but, maybe you get American leak detection in there. If you know your water usage is really high relative to the number of sites, sewer lines with camera, electric, we have the electrician check out pretty thoroughly. Roads, we do a visual inspection. Park-owned homes, we check out. And then the other big expense is often trees, right? So, the deferred maintenance on your typical community, that seller's not, spending 20 grand, 30 grand to trim a bunch of trees.
Right.
And then you have an issue where, you have a big storm, something might fall, something might hit something, and it's just not worth the risk.
Yeah, trees are one that I've learned the hard way of how expensive it is to get rid of trees. Broke, because I'll look at it and think, okay, that's going to be 8,000 or 10,000, and if I didn't get a bid beforehand, it's like the bids are 25 and 30. Is like, oh crap, I didn't think about that. So now it's like, okay, I got to get bids, and then you got to get an apples bid, because if you let the arborist tell you which ones need to go, you're going to get rid of twice as many, and you're going to go broke. But so get more than one arborist. That would be my tip there.
Definitely.
And look for black walnut. If you got black walnut trees, you can harvest them. They're really valuable. Yeah. My dad has a farm, and he thought it was a black walnut, and he called the arborist, and they have to be at least, I think, 12 or 18 inches wide. And they like them in timber areas because they've never had garage sale signs posted on them. With, in the neighborhood, people have hammered garage sale signs on them, so they ruin the wood. They use it for fancy furniture, and they use it for a kind of furniture veneer. So my dad told the guy, I got 100-foot tall, 4-foot wide black walnut, and the guy's like, that's a $25,000 tree. And he's like, I'm coming over this afternoon. I want this one. And my dad walks over and points at it and said, what do you think? And the guy said, where's the black walnut?
Oh,
he goes, right there. He goes, that's not black walnut. There's like, there's gold and fool's gold, and they look similar. There's a type of tree. So I've learned to look at it like, yeah, that's not it. Oh, that might be it. But dad thought he hit a jackpot with that tree. And he's like, I like the tree, but for that price, I'll let it go. I got 100 other trees, but just we had a bunch of black walnut on the farm, but they're not mature yet. They're 8 inches wide or whatever. So they're not worth any money at this point.
You see, good to know. Because we're usually of the mind of, if the tree's hanging or it's slanted or what have you, we'll chop it. And then our big thing is, just the community beautification, right? We've taken over a lot, I'm sure you have too, where people just leave the roots in, they leave the trunk because they don't want to spend the extra $250 to remove.
Yeah. Hey, I've done that before. And then I'm like, kick myself later. It looks like you're being cheap. That's the only reason to leave the stump it.
Oh yeah.
Because a lot of times that's a big expense. Like I got a tree in Kansas City that's, I don't know, 3 or 4 feet wide. And get rid of the stump was another $1,500 or something. I'm like, don't worry about it. But then now it's like regrowing into an odd shape. I'm like, I should have just got rid of it when I had the guy on site.
We had that with one we took over where the stump was there and then another tree grew out like diagonally from the stump. And then you're just stuck doing it again. And so, we just want to do that on the front end. Speaking of the front end, really quickly, one thing I did want to touch on for, my background is in tax. So one thing I always do, at least when it comes to the seller deliverables, is really deep dive into P&Ls. I'm sure you do too. But then taking the P&Ls and comparing them to the P&L on the partnership return, right? So your typical deal is owned by a partnership. It's a 1065. You go about 7 pages in, you've got an 8825, and it's the P&L. And so that's one place where most people, if they're not telling the truth to the IRS, they're not overstating their income.
Exactly.
Right. And so what we try to do is we take that 8825, you look at that P&L, you add back the interest, you add back the depreciation, you add back the amortization. And if you're comfortable with that NOI, then it's okay. Hey, that's a good enough NOI relative to our price where we'll move forward.
So how do you deal with it and I've done the same thing. And a lot of times the sellers even tell me on the front end, hey, just so you know, I don't claim all the income. And it's like, so I used to always just say, well, then I'm not going to count it. I'm going to go with the income on your tax return. Well, but if that's 50 cents on the dollar, I lose the deal. They're not going to cut the price 50 cents on the dollar. So then I have to back into what I think it really is and how much is cash or how much is bad collections or family discounts. I mean, so I feel like I've gotten more and more jaded on the tax return in general. Like I put less and less weight into it because it's never seemingly consistent and seemingly accurate. So how do you look at it? Because otherwise you're gonna be killing a lot of deals if you go on just the tax return.
Oh, definitely. I'm referring to it more as a floor, right? So this is the lowest it should be.
Okay.
But like you said, a lot of people say they claim cash. And you'll know this too, right? So as you're getting into the weeds, you can tell which homes are occupied, which ones aren't occupied.
Right.
Right. And then one of the things we definitely ask for in our deliverables is a delinquency report. Right. This is where we've had, deals turn out to be amazing. And other ones where I was doing one recently, it was over 100 sites. Everything checked the boxes, right? It was one of those where, hey, we can't sign this fast enough. It's got to be in the catch. Okay. Last two things. How much is left on the RPO balances for these 4 or 5? And then what's the delinquency report? 27 out of the 100 were delinquent over 2 months, right? So the 1 month we'll deal with a couple people here and there. But what we saw, especially post-COVID, was there were so many state programs that were giving rental assistance. And we had a lot of tenants who were relying on that. And then when that assistance dried up, then they either chose to stop paying rent or they didn't want to go back to the normal way of things where it's like, okay, you have to work or you have to get Social Security or somehow you've got to generate income household wise to get your rent paid. And
we've had some similar. I'm actually somewhat surprised with how strong collections have been post government money. I anticipated a lot more people failing to pay because they had not paid in a long time. And there are certainly people in that camp, but there's I was pleasantly surprised that more of them were like, okay, I guess I'll start paying again. Because we've had some people who were there for 3 years and never paid a single payment. Yeah. But they were current, right? So we didn't evict them, but it was just a matter of time. And then I got a guy right now, we filed eviction on him like 4 times in Illinois, and he keeps finding some government program. And I mean, we're like, now the government program is out. And if you try to apply, they don't even accept applications. Well, this last week, he convinced the judge again, he's going to get more assistance. So they gave him another continuance to go get more assistance. And we don't want the guy. He's also suspected of dealing drugs. So we don't want the guy, regardless, his money's no good here. And the judge keeps making us.
And especially in certain states and certain municipalities, you see that, right? We own one in Illinois and we will never be buying another one in Illinois. Right. That's just how it is. We had a 60 site community, and through COVID, because it spread like wildfire. A couple of people didn't pay rent. There was an eviction moratorium. So we couldn't get them out unless it was health and safety reasons. They tell other people, well, you guys are suckers. Why are you paying rent?
Right.
Right. And so then, like you said, there's two camps. Most of our properties, collection's been amazing because what's the alternative, right? If you're operating a working man's park or an average, community, there is no real feasible option at the same level of rent. It just doesn't exist.
Yeah, one thing, we had a problem with it at first, but we've really turned it around, and I like Illinois more than most. But keeping in mind, I left at 18 and never went back. But one thing that has helped us is after we evict somebody, we put it in the lease that if Jason gets evicted, Jason can't move in with you. He can't be a guest. He can't be your co-tenant, your roommate. And if you let Jason in, you are evicted for violating this lease provision. So, because we had one family that hopped to 5 different houses, and then we'd evict the second house and the third, and we'd in one community. This was in Missouri. We evicted 5 people in a row, and it was just the same idiot and a couple idiots. They get growing until at one point there's 10 idiots in the same single wide. And it was just like, man, it was pulling teeth with that community. And as soon as we got rid of we kind of watched it like, I don't think he has any more friends left. And once we got rid of his last friend, like the world changed, like, all right, those guys are gone. And now we can all of a sudden start selling houses because they had junk everywhere. You couldn't sell it. The guy's got 6 dumpsters full of junk. You can't sell the house next door. Right. So, and then they take their junk and move it over again. And so you could follow the beer cans to the next trailer they were living in.
And this is one thing that we do, which is an additional expense, but I think it's some of the best money we do. If we've got a vacant lot, every spring we'll just bring in a 30-yarder, right? And we will pay for the cost of it, but there's so much accumulation, and you got to keep in mind, so many of these homes, if all you have is a home and a shed, and you're collecting stuff, you're going to be bursting at the seams, and it's going to start getting outside, and we don't want that. Right. So we do enforce the rules, but at the same time, we kind of give that outlet of, hey, let's fill up the 30-yarder. And we might go through 3 or 4 of them, right? It might be a $2,000 expense, but at the end of the day, the value that we believe we derive from it is far exceeds that $2,000 expense.
I'm under a contract on a park right now, and it's got about 40 occupied out of 100 plus. So kind of low occupancy, but the amount of junk is unbelievable. I have budgeted 20 30-yard dumpsters, and I told the dumpster guy, I didn't do it, but somebody else, the accounting told him, bring me 5, and then we'll bring you 5 more. I want reserve 20, but in case I need to stop or in case I need more, but I'm expecting 20 full. And that's the most I've ever used by far. But it's like, it's just junk everywhere.
That's a lot for 40 occupied.
Yeah. Well, part of it's there's 150 sites, and they switched gas from a natural gas to propane at some point, but all the old gas risers are sticking out of the ground in all these vacant lots. So you got 2 feet of pipe everywhere. And then you got other, water meters and things like that, not heat rods that they've pulled out from frozen, and they just leave them in the yard. So you've got just in the community, they've been weed eating around this stuff for 10 years. Like, you could pay to throw it away once and you'll save on your mowing bill. Yeah.
Oh yeah, completely. But instead, I feel like that's a lot of the way cheaper operators have operated for years, where it's, the Band-Aid method, but it ends up proving to be much more costly in the long run than just doing it the right way. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
2 other things I just want to touch on real quick. I know we are getting reassessed more and more on the property tax side, in most of the states we are operating in. So that's just something that I think, anyone watching this, just keep an eye on, because if you're baking in your NOI based on the prior guy's property taxes, those might not be yours, even in some of the states in which they're supposedly rolling and it doesn't get triggered by a sale. I've had it happen a few times. I've been fairly successful in the tax appeal, and for our audience, I think it's episodes 9 and 10. I specifically get into that topic, but yeah, I mean, property taxes are a big bite, and they can be. So you got to be real cautious about it. But there are some strategies to try to mitigate some of that pain.
And one of them that has got other legal flaws is to buy the LLC of the seller, but I had a whole episode on that too. But that doesn't work if they own it in their personal name, right? Unless you're going to go create an LLC right then, but that could trigger it too. So yeah, triggering provisions on sale, and a lot of states are not disclosure states, so the assessor doesn't often know. But I've found that in general, you typically want to buy communities in highly populated counties. Well, the downside of that is highly populated counties have more professional assessment departments and sophistication and staff and money. So they're more likely to catch your sale. If you're in a rural area, you could buy a property. I've had property. I have one property. I bought it. It didn't go up. I sold it. It didn't go up. I bought it back. It didn't go up. This is in a county in Illinois, and I've been through reassessment cycles, and I went up 3% or whatever the whole region did, but I bought it for, I think, twice what I bought it for the first time. So it's gone up sizably, but so it's kind of a luck of the draw. It's hard to underwrite that risk because you don't really want to call the county, in my opinion, and be like, "Hey, I'm thinking about buying this trailer park for $3 million. You have it valued at $800,000. Are you going to keep it at $800,000? Or are you going to value it at $3 million?" Like, no. So sometimes we'll call and we'll say we're considering buying commercial property in this jurisdiction. How do you guys reassess? I've used to do that, but then I never really got the good answers. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, we always try our best. We do the most accurate value possible. We have a whole comprehensive process," and they don't come out and say we're going to tag your value. But some of them, I had it happen once. They just said we're going to tag your value, and then they did. But then I had to appeal it, and I won. But it still was a huge pain in the butt. And then it was like $17,000 tax increase. Put that on a 6 cap. That was no fun. 30 days in. Exactly.
What we've seen is, I'm thinking one state in particular, where they'll figure out what you bought it for, and then they'll come under that about 10 to 15%, and then reassess at that, and then basically say, okay, well, tell us why we're wrong.
Yeah. I used to be the county appraiser in Jackson County, Missouri, here in Kansas City, and I went to state assessors association, and there was one assessor. So the rule of Missouri is the assessor is supposed to be within 90% of value. So they basically let you be 10% low, because then you get less appeals, less phone calls, you need less staffing. But this guy wanted to be like 30% below because he wanted to get reelected. So eventually the state audited him, and they're like, "You need to get your values up." He goes, "Oh, I know, mine are really way too low." He goes, "But I'm going to need that in writing." And then when people come to his office complain, he goes, "The state made me do it. I'm your local assessor. Vote for me. See you at bowling tomorrow night." They said, "You must increase all values 30% across the board." He goes, my hands were tied. If it had been a different assessor, they'd have probably increased him 40. And that was he was telling people this, I'm purposely doing this to continue to get this cush job.
Oh my gosh. I love it. Love the war stories.
Yep. Right. All right, taxes. What else you got, Jason? Any other tips or tricks?
The only other
I know you got a bunch, but
the only other thing I would put on people's radar, which we are seeing in select states, is just local places trying to change the zoning, right? Trying to go through the zoning route, especially if you've got something that's grandfathered in, it's legal non-conforming, all over the place. What you can build back, what you can't build back. The age of the homes you're allowed to bring in, whether you're able to bring homes in, right? That's another big fight is, this whole idea of whether it's site specific of abandoned use versus the whole property. To me, it's mind blowing. But, if you had a 100 space community and 40 of them are vacant, you should be able to bring in 40 homes on those vacant lots, right? But there are some places that say no.
It's a struggle, man. We see that we do it all the time. Zoning probably in 100+ cities. We've done it in, and we've seen it where there's no code, and we've seen it where the code is exceptionally onerous. I got a call this afternoon on one actually, where the city says within 15 days of transfer, all non-conforming components must be brought into conforming status. So upgrade all the pedestals, put in sort of concrete, fill the lots or forever lose them. So I mean, it's extremely onerous, and there's portions that are arguably valid under the city's police power, but many of them are an overreach. So yeah, I'd say getting the zoning right is a big deal, and I see people mess it up all the time, and a lot of times they call me after the fact, hey, can you help? And I'm like, you got to sue the city because they're not going to cave. They've told us that you got to sue the city. And like, well, we're only talking about 5 of my 19 lots. I was like, okay, well, what's your lot rent? $200. Well, it's probably not worth suing over. I'm sorry to tell you this, but you just lost those 5 lots. And if a home burns down, you lost 6 and 7. And so if I were you, I wouldn't pay the lawyer. I'd pay the listing broker, and I'd try to dump that thing to the greater fool. But that we see that all the time. And sometimes you can fight them. We're fighting a city right now via lawsuit on one that they consider electric pedestals and concrete that has not been used for 6 months to be abandoned and in violation of the code and basically as junk. So you have to, they're trying to make us remove, this is not my part, it's for a client, but trying to make us remove the existing electric and concrete on 100+ pad sites that are vacant. And the goal of this property and this acquisition was fill the vacant pad sites.
Yeah.
And they're saying, no, the last guy didn't use them for 5 years. So not only can you not use them or upgrade them, you have to rip out the infrastructure, which is obviously a big expense.
That's insane. Yeah. And even nowadays, I mean, look, we're still constantly pouring pads, right? And that cost has gone up significantly.
Yeah.
Like, old days, we just needed some gravel and you were allowed to put it on that. And then it turned into runners, then it turned into full pads. And
it depends on the state and depends on new versus used. Some states they're lax on the used. So I've actually done it where I can overpay for a used home relative to a new home, because a used home, like here in Missouri, you can put a used home on the dirt. You don't have to have gravel. Kansas, they want crushed gravel, and Illinois and Missouri, if you a new home, they want piers or pad. We typically do the piers instead of the pad. But new homes have in some states, and I got a lot of clients that are in the South and Southeast, and they're like, we don't even know what concrete costs. We don't even thought about concrete. You're paying for concrete? Like, yeah, it's like $4,000 a whack. They're like, what?
Yeah. We've got a bunch of that, especially, where we've seen on the zoning, just to go back to this I've got one where we've got to do full concrete pads. They said, oh, well, this is how we treat all of our manufactured housing communities. And I'm just standing there. I'm like, no, you have one. It's us. Right.
Yeah, that hurts, because they could you're probably lucky that's all they're doing, because they can say we're treating all of them fairly. It just happens to be only one. And it's like, crap. And that could, back on tax appeals, that becomes a challenge on tax appeals too. Like, how much did all the other mobile home parks go up? And they're like, there are none. And in some jurisdictions, like in I own parks in my hometown of Quincy, Illinois, in Adams County. We've had 3 or 4 parks in that county, and it's all in the same county, but they have townships.
Yeah.
So I did one tax appeal, and they're like, well, the county is this big, but in our township, you're the only one. And then in my township, they went up 20%. In the other township, they went up 5%. So I was like, you couldn't. So there is another level of assessment and supervisor of assessments that you can take those appeals to, but it's not at the informal, inexpensive level. So I had to make a formal tax appeal with the state, and then you got to go through that process, and I had to hire a local attorney. My eviction attorney stamped the paper. Don't tell anybody that. But you got to hire a local attorney, local appraiser, and right out of the gate, there's $5,000.
Yeah. Yeah. Before not a guaranteed result either, right?
Sure.
That's $5,000 for a shot of getting what you want done.
Exactly. And sometimes it's not, if you do, it depends on the state, but depends on some states. If you appeal, it's either you break even, like you just lose and they keep your value, or you get the successful reduction. But some places they also can go up.
Yeah.
So you got to be careful. Like, okay, I bought it for $1 million. It went from 400,000 to 600,000. I'd like to get it back to 400,000. but I don't want it to go to $1 million. So I'll just take my medicine, you know, and that's a business calculation there as well.
Yeah. Now we had one in Wisconsin, bought it a long time ago. They had never reassessed in over a decade, probably 2 decades. And then they came out, property taxes went from $900 to $9,000.
Oh.
And the problem is the reassessed amount was still less than the actual value of the community, right? So then, and you're running into that situation where they can appraise it up to fair market value. Do you want to take that risk to what you're saying? And so that was one of those where, we actually got the residents involved and we said, hey, look, we don't like to raise the rent, especially if it's unnecessary. But, here's what happened. There's your local assessor. You can talk to them, but everyone's going to have to, do a $30 rent increase because even after that, we're still net negative just on the property taxes.
Yeah. That's a tough one, man.
Yeah.
All right. This is good stuff, Jason. Before we jump, anything else you want to share, tips or tricks, or how can people find you too? I want to make sure you get a chance to.
Oh, definitely. I guess final couple of thoughts are, before you're really pricing it out, get a soft financing quote. So you got an idea what your loan terms are going to be. If you're not doing this often, you want to know what your rate, AM, and term are, because that's going to get factored into your model, and that's going to depend whether or not you can actually close at the price you said, right? Don't be one of the guys that just ties stuff up, retrades it, messes it up for the rest of us at a high price that's never going to happen.
Right.
Right. CapEx budget, call FERD, get your entities formed, get your leases, your rules and regulations. And then on closing, make sure you try to get all your titles, right? If you're, we're stuck getting a lot of homes often, and try to get as many titles as possible, try to get them matched up. Hopefully there's HUD plates. That's another thing where we definitely run into. I had an amazing escrow company. They actually filed every one of the titles for us at closing.
Wow.
And so
titles give me gray hair, man. Chasing those down is such a pain after closing.
Especially on the older homes where you can't identify them, right? You're looking on the hitch, you're looking, near the water heater, under the sink, everywhere, but you might not be able to find them. Other than that, Ferd, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. I listen to you. I love the podcast.
Hey, thanks for coming on, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Neiman. Ready to learn more? Go to www.themobilehomelawyer.com for free resources and materials to help you succeed. If you love the podcast, go to Apple Podcasts, give us your review, and subscribe today. Thank you for listening. Neither the Supreme Court of Missouri nor the Missouri Bar reviews nor approves certifying organizations or specialist designations. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertisements.